fair. Also das ist noch eine Final-Geschichte.
Sonst drücken wir dann zusammen.
Nein, ich weiß nicht. Also,
meine Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen,
es kann nicht wirklich menschengerecht sein, was nicht.
there cannot be justice for humans without an acceptance of the way things are, and you cannot accept the way things are if they run counter to human rights. That is something which has been key to the recognitions of the Swiss theologian and the social ethics scientist Arthur Rich, whose 100th birthday we are celebrating today.
Pragmatism and human justice are not alternative guiding principles amongst which you can choose. They belong together quite objectively. Without factual competence and without understanding complex circumstances, intervention from theologian and ethical sides become moralizing self-opinionatedness. And without human justice, without social ethical principles, the economy becomes the battleground of egoists. I would like to welcome you to the Open Forum Davos 2010, and I do this on behalf of the Swiss Federation of Protestant Churches and also on behalf of André Schneider, the representative of the WEF, who unfortunately has not been able to be with us today. It is the basic idea of the Open Forum to organize in parallel to the World Economic Forum at the same time and at the same place a forum which is open to the public with panelists from civil society, politics and economy to debate subjects. It should be a contradictory debate on very topical, very burning issues. This afternoon we will begin with the topic of Switzerland, Misfit or model, but I can also tell you that instead of using the word misfit, we had also thought of other possible words. This evening, the subject will be after the financial crisis, consequences and lessons learned. Here, the Federation of Swiss Protestant Churches would like to invite you to talk about the financial issue from the villagers, from the church point of view. And we have a position paper that is available to you. Please read it, and we will be happy to hear about your opinions. Tomorrow we will then speak about climate change, and then Friday evening, does religion's claim to truth lead to violence? Saturday, we will then take up the challenge of the aging society. We will also put the question, yes, we can, or yes, can we, with a question mark after a year of Obama in the United States. And in the evening, it will be a world without nuclear weapons, utopia. And in all these debates, we want to look at factual consequences, what is pragmatic, the complex factual connections, and human rights. That is to say, everything that is fair and just for all human beings that share a common fate, and to see these two principles on the same footing. The Open Forum is the expression of a basic conviction that was also shared by Arthur Rich, a pioneer in co-determination in the economy, when he postulated that economic subjects should become economic citizens. Recognize, debate, change, that is the purpose of the Open Forum, and I would like to thank all the panelists and particularly all those who are here, all the participants here at this Alpine Middle School for participating in this year's forum. Thank you.
Welcome, have a seat, nehmen Sie Platz. Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In Italy, under the Borgias, there reigned 30 years of war, terror, murder, and assassination. But it also produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. Switzerland and the Swiss lived in brotherly harmony for 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did they produce? The Cuckoo Clock. This rather malicious sentence was spoken by Orson Welles as the third main character in The Third Man. And the American information services today, as Orson Welles, are lousy researchers because the Cuckoo Clock comes from the Black Forest. But it did hurt me to the quick. Is this the image that the world has of us? Does it see us as peaceful bulls, skilled in electronics and fine mechanics, but meaningless, producing meaningless objectives, but not able to produce great feats? But after the vote on the minarets, I felt that peaceful bulls is perhaps not the worst image that we can convey. What if the world sees us as evil and selfish, small-minded people? Or perhaps the world sees us self-confident hermits and loners who, like at the time Wilhelm Tell, would not let anyone tell them what they had to do? Or are we perhaps an example to be copied? However, there's a lot of potential in this image and metaphor of the Cuckoo Clock. So much so that before I came to Davos, I bought a simple model of a cuckoo clock in Zurich in a tourist shop that sells kitsch stuff. And it should remind us that sometimes even the clumsiest cliches force us to make a very clinical analysis to refute it. But the clock is running, it's ticking, and we only have a little less than 1 hour to discuss with these brilliant panelists the debates the subjects that we have today. And they are such excellent panelists, and I'm sure that they could speak for more than a quarter of an hour on the subject. But if anyone speaks for too long, this is the Cuckoo Clock that will simply interrupt your intervention. That is my threat, and the Damocles sword that is hanging over your head. However, it may be that after 1 minute of intervention, I will interrupt you and simply pass on the ball to another panelist. But interrupting means not breaking off. The ball can be passed back or to a third person. These panelists are excellent people. Even the best monologue can be bettered by a good dialogue. I know that at the Open Forum we have a high-quality, highly interested public. So instead of making long speeches and taking inventory, we should go right into the debate because you know the subjects very well. I hope that you are all going to work together like the good little cogwheels in a Swiss watch of Swiss movement. That was my introduction. Now I will simply lubricate the wheels and the cogs as moderator and will shed light on this dream team of a panel. I hope you will be able to applaud and welcome the prima inter pares of the Swiss, the very young but very experienced president of the Swiss National Council, the lower chamber of the Swiss Parliament. I'm going to be very neutral, and I proceed by alphabetical order. We have one of the most read and highly reputed historian, the Scots, who teaches in Harvard, the economic historian Niall Ferguson, ladies and gentlemen. Governmental Switzerland is represented by no less than the permanent representative of our country at the UN, Mr. Peter Maurer. One big issue that we want to talk about today is how are we seen from the outside, and who else could assess this any better than the man who writes for the favorite daily of the world elite, the Financial Times, and reports about Switzerland, and studied philosophy, politics, and economics at the University of Oxford, and has written his dissertation on German and French politics, and has written for the Financial Times in various cities, Mr. Haig-Simonian, and last but not least of all, coming from the most refined of Swiss universities, the University for Economics, at the theoretical level, the Smithy producing future executives, Deputy Director of the Institute for Ethics in Economics from the University of St. Gall, Ulrich Thielemann. First question to Pascale Bruder. What comes to your mind, first of all, when you think of Scotland? Just spontaneously. Well, a wonderful language that I can hardly understand, even though I do speak English. It's a bit like Swiss German, very and then pastures and the cliché. You wanted to hear that. The stingy Scotsman, even too stingy to wear underwear at times. What about the music the Scots play? Is that another cliché? Do you still speak German? You wrote a book at the time. You lived in Hamburg. It's a bit difficult for me to speak German, but I'll try. Tell me if I make too many mistakes.
Das ist wirklich einfach. Also, was kommt Ihnen bei Schweiz oder früher, was kam Ihnen bei Schweiz?
Well, what did come to your mind first when you thought of Switzerland, not cuckoo clocks? For a historian, the history of this country is very interesting and also very important. When I was still studying in Oxford and was teaching in Oxford, I didn't quite understand why we were teaching or learning so little about Switzerland, Italy, Germany, France, but hardly anything about Switzerland. Does that mean that no one was really interested in Switzerland? Yes, that may be one answer. It's very strange if one thought about it at all. Religion was very important in Switzerland. Think of Jean Calvin. Calvinism is extremely important in European history. Max Weber's theory, for example, of the Protestant ethic, that's very much linked to Calvin. And for economic history, Switzerland also very important. But why does the Western world not really show any interest in Switzerland? I don't know, no explanation. But there's only one historian, Jonathan Steinberg, who has written a book about the history of Switzerland. I really have no other explanation. As an economic historian, it's quite obvious. Switzerland is just as important a country as England, for example, in the context of the history of the Industrial Revolution, and we need to study it more. We have to take it seriously, and we are not taking it seriously. You just think some peasants who are doing their work. What about the other intellectual that was trained in Oxford, Mr. Somin? Was any interest in Switzerland? No, not at all. The only thing that we think of about Switzerland is tourism, chocolate, and happy cows, and that's about the limits of my knowledge, or was when I came to Switzerland 6 years ago. Do you have any explanation why Switzerland seems to be under the radar? Well, there are several reasons. Switzerland is quite small, plus minus 7 million inhabitants, very neutral, no major wars, not much destruction, no great battles. I think that's so no drama, no tragedy, so no subject. Now, Mrs. Bruder, you are the first amongst all Swiss citizens. But it's a bit like the tall poppy syndrome in Switzerland. You cut off the heads that seem to be egregious. Well, I'm only 163 tall, so I'm not the highest or the tallest. In French, it's just we say the French of all citizens. I think that is very appropriate. The Swiss would like to have a president of the parliament who is very close to the population. Yes, this is very clear in the Swiss Sunday newspapers. And we just heard that what is not commensurate with pragmatism is not fair for human justice. And I think the forum is very good about showing this by organizing this debate here today. So official Switzerland is not really represented by you, but by the representative at the UN, the representative of the government of Switzerland in UN. But you have already met other presidents of other national parliaments. You've met the president of the Hungarian parliament. Yes, that's right, and also the representative of the Saudi Arabian parliament, because the president will be visiting Switzerland in a short while. So I keep hearing from everyone that Switzerland can really play an important role at the international level as a mediator. After the decision taken about the minarets in Switzerland, it doesn't mean or didn't mean that all the negotiations or talks only went in that direction. But Switzerland is seen as a force to be counted with at the international level. At least that is what people tell me when I meet them and when we talk about the role of Switzerland. I also followed with very much interest what has been said. No one has said that Switzerland isn't important, but is simply not noticed, isn't noticed enough. People don't come up to you and say, I'm so happy to be in Swaziland. No, usually it's Sweden. Switzerland is often mistaken for Switzerland. Now, before I turn to Mr. Maurer, Mr. Thielemann, you teach in Switzerland, but you come from Germany. There's a very interesting relationship between Switzerland and Germany. It makes you laugh, but that's also quite interesting. How are we perceived in Germany? As the sweet little neighbor? No, I really can't tell you because I've been living in Switzerland for too long. There's a blend of that. Switzerland is simply too small to be perceived, but it is perceived as a very strange country from various points of views. It's not a member of the EU. It speaks nearly the same language as in the country that I come from, the big neighbor. So I don't really know what the picture, the image is. It's contradictory. There's the banking secrecy that plays a role. Then the tradition of protecting and defending human rights, Geneva, the Red Cross. Everyone knows that the Red Cross has its origin in Switzerland. So it's a very ambivalent image. And that's not just seen by specialists and the elite. It's also the man in the street. Yes, I think everyone knows that the Red Cross comes from Switzerland. Everyone knows that the UN has some headquarters in Geneva. So it's an ambivalent image, a perception. Well, we'll take account of that. Now, Mr. Maurer, you're just one out of 193 countries represented at the UN. And how are you perceived by the other representatives at the UN? Is this a country that produces cuckoo clocks or not? No. Switzerland does have its political profile at the UN. It is perceived as a country only to the extent that it contributes to the work done at the UN, contributes to help solving problems that are debated at the UN, to promote peace and security, humanitarian aid, protection of the environment. Is this a positive perception? Yes, this is a positive perception because it has its policies, because it does contribute to solving these problems. We are esteemed by the 193 other UN members. Okay, debate over, so problem solved. Well, is there a problem or not? I'm sure that Switzerland is either perceived in different ways or not perceived at all. We'll see that depending on the circumstances. But would you say that there's a problem, Mrs. Bruder, because of the banking secrecy, for example? You really specifically is mentioning the banking secrecy and not just in general terms. Yes, there's something to that. I think we need to, we owe explanations to the outside world regarding the banking secrecy. There is a reproach made. We haven't really done very much enough about it. There are certain voices that have been speaking out against the banking secrecy. One of the voices is yours, right? No, I don't think you can say that. But it's mainly the left that has spoken out very clearly against the banking secrecy. And there's also this debate about tax evasion and fraud. Had one spoken about that a few years ago, one would have not be seen very positively in Switzerland. Our early warning system in Switzerland has to come into operation better so that we don't have to defend ourselves and do it from a corner with our backs to the wall. We need to react much more early. Mr. Simonian, you've been observing us for very many years. Do you feel that this is a discussion that is being swept under the carpet? No, I wouldn't say so. I agree with Mrs. Bruderer. The banking secrecy is not only important for one sector of the economy, but for the entire economy. For decades, very cheap capital has been banked in Switzerland and has been used for the Swiss economy. Now, the Swiss banks in this phase of transition have to find a different solution. Unfortunately, the politicians have not found the solution. They failed, and it's going to be very interesting to see what solution the bankers will come up with, because they have failed. Can you say that the bankers and the politicians have failed? No, it's the government that has failed. Now, why? Why is that? Well, first of all, I want to make it quite clear that I'm not the government, and I'm a representative of the government. And I'm more part of the administration. I agree with Mrs. Bruderer. Many voices and people have warned us, not only in Switzerland but outside of the country. And many who used to defend the banking secrecy have now changed their position and have invited us to change our position. For many of the Swiss representatives working throughout the world have noticed that this acceptance is dwindling. The profile of a country depends very much also on how a country is perceived. And this is particularly so for a small country like Switzerland that needs to be perceived very clearly. And that's part of the reality. And one has to understand in Switzerland that abroad, these subjects are simply not accepted in the same way as they are in Switzerland. So there's this gap between self-perception and perception on the outside. Mr. Ferguson, you are the guru worldwide when it comes to the attitude a country has to money, to finance, and you've also said this very clearly in the book you wrote, The Role of Money. Someone said that if if you see a Swiss banker jumping out of the window, jump after him because there's some money to be made out of it. Would you agree that Switzerland is only intent on money? Yes, to some extent, especially if the banker is employed by the UBS. Well, maybe he jumps out of the window for other reasons. A year ago, I would have said that the Swiss model was in danger, was very weak. This was at the time when everyone was talking about a new world order. The G20 was in a position of laying down the rules or changing the rules of the financial world order. Now, in the last 2 months, the situation has changed again. In the US and in Great Britain, governments are diverging. They're going in two different directions. And this means that Switzerland has a possibility of simply maintaining the status quo. If the international system is not modified, nothing will change. Then Switzerland will simply maintain the status quo. In fact, there are only 3 important international financial centers: New York, London, and Switzerland. if London and New York agree about something, if they agree that the system has to be changed, then Switzerland has no alternative. It has to follow suit. But London and New York are not in agreement, so this is an opportunity for Switzerland. I think we're talking about Switzerland, says Mrs. Bruder, but the problem is much bigger than Switzerland. Yesterday, I listened very carefully to what was said at the opening session of the World Economic Forum, and everyone was saying we have to pull on the same oar. We all have to go in the same direction. We have to make sure that there are certain rules. But you're not very optimistic, no? No, I'm rather pessimistic. After the disaster in Massachusetts, where a Republican has taken the seat of the Democrats, there seems to be a bit of a wind of panic blowing through Washington. There was an urge to change the rules, but this seems to have changed. They may still be changed, but the government of the UK has gone off into a different direction, and Switzerland can then be an opportunist and make use of this situation. Yes, it's very unfortunate, because we need an international solution if we want to maintain or restore the financial order, and the possibility is dwindling.
Einig ist, dann bleiben wir, wie wir sind.
So if nothing changes, we'll stay where we are. Well, I don't think that the Swiss government intends to use the discrepancies that are existing in the different positions. Maybe these are just temporary. I think we can take time, and during this time we can ensure that we can change the way we act so that the transition to a regulatory environment which is improved can go ahead smoothly. So I don't think that there's a fundamental problem in that. I think it's just a question of time. The Swiss government has to use this time intelligently in order to ensure that it can place itself better as a financial center in the world and ensure its integrity and its position. Well, you're like the public in America. You read about these battles in the paper with Krugman, who's more on the left, an economist. You're more of a conservative academic. Well, it has little to do with politics. It's a question of theory. He's a Keynesian through and through, and I'm somewhat skeptical about public debt being the solution. But you're a European liberal. You're economically liberal in the European meaning. Would you say that the Swiss can keep banking secrecy? Absolutely not. No, that cannot be morally justified. It's difficult to say whether it will survive or not. It seems that the outlook is better than it was a year ago for that. Mr. Thielemann, last year you went to Berlin to a committee of the Bundestag where there were discussions relating to banking secrecy. You raised a lot of criticisms of Switzerland. Why? Did you think it was so morally wrong that you had to read your host the rights? No, it's a complete misunderstanding. I didn't speak about my own views. I was invited by the Finance Committee of the Bundestag. That was a great opportunity. The banking secrecy that was discussed was between the tax authorities. So I was speaking about that. When this discussion began to be heard in Switzerland, we were familiar with the arguments, and there was very little discussion. Very little was taken seriously. We heard some fairly far-fetched arguments. It's good that the discussion took place, but the committee that I went to was not a public committee, and then the question was put to me of whether I felt it was necessary that Germany should make a law which would provide for sanctions for tax havens like Switzerland. And I said that that would be necessary because for a place like Switzerland, there is no understanding of the problems. There is no understanding. And I think that the dominant part of the political elites have not come to the understanding. It has very little to do with Switzerland, but rather a libertarian economic viewpoint. It's if you like, a moral mission. And I don't think that this is a view which can be supported in the long term. The problem is in Switzerland that there hasn't been a general public debate which has gone into this question in depth. Now, the Swiss population has clearly spoken against the question of banking secrecy. Obviously, banking secrecy could be kept, but not if it's being used to dodge taxes. I think recent opinion polls in the Sonntagszeitung, for example, have shown that result. And so it's clear, it's not pleasant to say, but the government needs to openly bring this issue to public debate. Churchill, I believe, said you can't criticize your home government while you're abroad. You should have done it here. Well, Mr. Tiedemann said something very important, and I'd like to stress it. Banking secrecy per se can be understood in different ways. It can be understood as a protection of the private rights. The automatic exchange of information has always been perceived negatively by the Swiss population. But there is an important distinction to be made between the ways in which tax are evaded, tax evasion and tax fraud. So there are different issues, and the public needs to be aware that there are different issues. And I regret the way that things have been done. It's not a question of eliminating banking secrecy, but simply eliminating those elements which are not justifiable and which are now under pressure. But the actual protection of the private sphere is not in question. Now, what getting rid of banking secrecy means is misunderstood. It's as if all of a sudden you could read people's bank accounts in the newspapers. Now, we are simply talking about relating to other tax authorities who are themselves subject to secrecy. So people lose sight of the issues. What does the Financial Times think? I think, well, over these last few minutes, we've seen the ambiguity here. We're talking about two different elements. And I must say that I, too, am divided on this. On the one hand, I cannot support tax evasion, and in the Financial Times, we would never do that. Particularly today, when so many states are in such desperate need of revenues, it's even less justifiable today than it was in the past. But what about data protection? I believe that we have right to our private data. Obviously, there are situations where you need to give your information to third parties, doctors, in criminal cases, for example. But do I want some kind of big brother? Obviously not. And what we all fear is that our tax authorities, who are interested in our capital and income revenues, may take upon themselves some of this big brother role. Maybe people in England respect the fact that Switzerland defend themselves, the Swiss defend themselves against the state. Well, I wouldn't go that far, but England does have a long liberal tradition. As you know, we have no personal identity cards. We only have a passport. This is one perspective on the unique British character. But I think there would be an understanding, not for the Swiss system per se, but the fact that a country can choose its own path. If Switzerland, Mr. Ferguson, has these conflicts with other countries, is it only going to get a bad image with the governments or with the people in the men in the street and the public at large? Well, I think it is a problem which goes beyond the views of the government. I don't know how broad the discussion that took place here was, but when books came out about Switzerland's role in the Second World War, Harold James's book on the role of the Deutsche Bank and the gold operations of Deutsche Bank in Switzerland in the Second World War. Now, when that book was published, it left a bad impression of Switzerland. So it seemed that Swiss neutrality had no financial dimension, and it certainly played an important role for me as a historian. And does it cause any damage? Do people like us less? Well, it is a problem. One of many. As I was walking here today, I met Paul Collier, the most famous economist for Africa in England, if not the world, and he wrote a book called The Bottom Billion, which was a book that clearly stated a very important question. How much of the money which is given to Africa has actually ended up in Swiss bank accounts? That's an important question. If people in England or America are talking about Switzerland, questions like that always come up. So that's poisonous, isn't it? I mean, even the organizers here asked whether we were a rogue state in the program for the Open Forum. Now, that's a question. Are we a rogue state? Lenin said that we were the world's, that we were something similar. Is that a problem? Is that something that could impact us at the UN? Well, we're a multifaceted country and we have many different activities, and I don't think we can say that the image of Switzerland is one thing alone. I think it's multifaceted as well. If we're talking about banking secrecy, then we have a problem of recognition in different industrialized countries, and we also have a problem of what was just talked about a moment with money from other countries ending up in Swiss bank accounts. But we also have to ask the question about what is the attractiveness of the banking secrecy and why are they leaving other countries? Because of bad governance, because of bad conditions. If I can be very strict about this, there are very few countries who allow themselves to influence the autonomy of other countries who don't recognize the autonomy, and Switzerland hasn't recognized that. It is different from other countries in the way that it adopts an offensive position. Now, I understand that you're representing the government, but I'm surprised that you don't recognize the problems or the other positions that are being argued for. I think it is unbelievable to say that it's legitimate to influence the tax autonomy of other countries because their taxes are too high is actually undermining the autonomy of other countries. The international community needs, as a whole, including Switzerland, to recognize legitimate tax autonomy of other countries. Well, I think that you can harmonize taxes at the international level. I think the international level is the way forward. There are pull and push factors of the banking secrecy, but these questions are legitimate. We need to ask them, and the good governance question needs to be asked as well. How do you ask the question in the Financial Times? Are we a country that is not sufficiently aware of what's going on elsewhere? Well, there are two different paths. One is that we look at for the example of the Geneva bankers who say that they are in the fifth or sixth generation of Geneva bankers. It's very difficult to convince these people that what worked 5 generations ago, 100 years ago, doesn't necessarily work today. They say that their ancestors bought back money from an African country because it was suffering from inflation and bad governance, so it was quite justified, taking money from Jewish survivors as well. And it's as if that morality is still justified today. It's obviously very difficult in that way to describe the situation fully, because we are facing that kind of mentality from Geneva and Zurich bankers. Now, the other way is whistleblowers, people who will pass on information. UBS, as Mr. Ferguson mentioned, is one of the best examples of most recent years. So there have been examples in Liechtenstein where employees of not a particularly senior position, but who were in sensitive positions, stole information and then sold it. In one case, directly to the German authorities. Another attempt failed to sell it to the German authorities, and a third attempt, again, to the French authorities. So it's possible to use whistleblowers to find out what's going on. Can I bring up another point, which I think is important to me as a diplomat? We've said that governments have failed to recognize in time that our understanding of banking secrecy, or the understanding of banking secrecy, is predominantly negative. Now, there is a discrepancy between external and internal views, and the challenge of domestic political positions and beliefs is very difficult to bring into line with the views that are held abroad. Every country has its issues which it has difficulty discussing with its foreign partners. The democratic process in our countries can be used to express the positions, and then it's up to diplomacy to communicate those abroad so that we can find solutions to national and international trends and try and bridge the discrepancies and the divergences. And there we have multilateral bodies like the UN, for example, where there are economic and political bodies where it is possible to express your own positions, to listen to other positions, and understand one another. Now, it's very difficult for the politicians, which has the public on its back. The public in Switzerland are very powerful, and we have direct democracy, so it's very difficult for the government to deal with such issues? Well, it's difficult, but it's very exciting. We have to have direct contact with the Swiss people, and I believe that that's right because it compels us as politicians. I can't speak on behalf of the government, but we have to constantly reflect about our conduct, about our actions. And we also need to think about whether we're being understood. And I think that that's a crucial element which we cannot go without. I'd like to touch upon another point because we have financial experts here. I think that in Switzerland we have obviously an important financial center. We have know-how, we have other advantages, which means that we can be very optimistic about the future without necessarily worrying about banking secrecy. Well, yes, obviously, over the next 2 years, we will see a lot of negotiations about banking secrecy. It will be reduced, but the Switzerland itself as a financial center is certainly not on the way out. It just has to be quite clever in its marketing so that it can sell its virtues. It's a long and convincing list, but that's your job. Yes, well, that's our job. I believe that too. Can I also reply to Mr. Thielmann because he didn't really find my question legitimate? I think that the problem that we face is that the questions that we're talking about might not be ethically legitimate, but they are politically legitimate because it's being asked. Well, what's the substance of the question? Once a question comes up in politics, a legitimate question. Well, you're saying good governance is the legitimate basis for Switzerland refusing the exchange of information. Well, what I said was that if we're talking about banking secrecy, then we cannot just discuss banking secrecy attracting flight money, but we have to ask at the same time why this money is in flight, why it's leaving countries and coming to Swiss bank accounts. Well, if you look at Germany, the tax burden is lower than in Switzerland. Middle-sized companies are suffering because it's not possible to raise taxes to a certain level because there are tax havens such as Switzerland. But if this were to be allowed, then it would have to be put onto a frozen account and certainly not serve Switzerland's own interests, and I'm sure that you'd agree with that. You have a moral duty.
I said it was legitimate to put the question and to ask about the two aspects or factors. If you look at it historically, fiscal competition is practiced in Switzerland. It's also articulated by politicians, well, with also an internal kind of emigration and variations and differences in cantonal differences. I'm just trying to explain why it is a legitimate question. Well, of course you can have different opinions, says the moderator. Franz Jäger would say, for example, if we are a tax oasis, then Germany is a tax desert, and that's why people want to move to the oasis. Yes, but that's my core question. Does a tax oasis have the right to receive money or to tax the money that comes from abroad, from people who are residents abroad? does a nation have a right to attract money magnetically from other countries? No, not the right. Not in the 21st century. That seems to be quite clear. Does Switzerland want to have the same image as the Cayman Islands, just to be the Cayman Islands with snow? I think that would be strange. I think Switzerland can have pretensions of being more than just a tax haven. Yes, but it's very symptomatic. What's the subject? It's Misfit or model? Well, Switzerland is made up of all sorts of pieces. There's the economy. We have a very good position when it comes to vocational training. We are always taken as a model. And what about the health system in the United States? Switzerland always taken as a model regarding its health system, health protection system. But let's look at the other case that's also very interesting, and then in another 6 minutes I'll open up the debate to the audience. Democracy. We haven't really spoken about democracy. Switzerland has always been admired for its democracy because its people can always have its say and have a say in the decisions. Is this seen as a model, as an example? Yes, certainly. If you think about it, one has to admit that Switzerland is a bit of a miracle. There's a very strange blend of minorities. Other countries have always had problems with these ethnic groups. I've written a book about the War of the World, and Switzerland really is an exception in European history. So this is really much more important than pure democracy. It's this coexistence between those who speak German and French and the other languages. And that's really an example for the world. So have we found the panacea? Have you described or studied the formula? I don't know whether you have, but it has to be studied by historians. Then there's another problem, because this democracy has decided something that has not really been accepted by the rest of the world because it didn't seem to be very democratic. Were you beaten on the next day at the UN, on the next day of this vote in Switzerland? No, no one hit me. But in this community of 193 nations, where the Islamic countries have such a great weight, the perception was very negative, the perception that these other countries had of Switzerland after the vote about the minarets. However, one also has to take the historic stance and understand that in Switzerland, direct democracy has existed for decades and centuries, has created a very special system guaranteeing well-being and economic development and prosperity. Even though there may have been one vote which one may not agree with politically, one cannot question the whole system. And I think that is perhaps the perception that many of my colleagues have or have had abroad. And this is something that can be explained. One can explain why such votes come about and why such a decision is taken by the people, and that one shouldn't then question fundamentally the very existence of the country. One should not question the historical acquisitions and what has been achieved by this system. Direct democracy, the purpose of direct democracy is not there to confirm simply or rubber stamp what the parliament has decided. Since 2001, in the case of 74 votes, 61 times the people followed the decision of the parliament, but then there are also the other situations. I am convinced that it is in these cases that direct democracy has a role to play, because it simply gives voice to opinions and gives weight to these opinions, which exist in other countries, but they are never expressed because other countries simply don't have such a system of direct democracy. So I feel that we are fortunate, that I belong to those in the majority of the parliament that was against this initiative, but I would never have had the idea of saying the next day, how are we going to change this or correct it, but rather ask ourselves, why didn't we know or realize beforehand that this vote would go the way it did? So it's a very, very interesting time, because we now have to handle this opinion, this public opinion. What are we going to do with it? It's an appeal to the government and to the parliament. I'm convinced that this same opinion exists in other countries, but is simply not expressed, isn't heard. So this is a great advantage that we have in Switzerland. It's also a great challenge, and it's a wonderful challenge for politicians to really understand and perceive very early on in a process what the public, what the population feels and thinks. And this is a dialogue that exists between the parliament, the government, and the people before, during, and after the vote. On the day after the vote, walking through the corridors of the UN, there's also a great difference between what the colleagues say officially and what they tell me when they drink a cup of coffee with me. Mrs. Bruder said it very clearly. There are a large number of countries and their representatives who know fully well that they have the same problems as Switzerland, and that a problem here has emerged and has, in Switzerland at least, been put on the political agenda that perhaps hasn't been done so in other countries. I agree with Mrs. Bruder that it's an immense challenge for us to explain to the rest of the world how we go about things in Switzerland, how direct democracy functions and operates. Who would like to put a question from the floor? Maybe you could start raising your hands and show if you want to participate in the discussion. Famous last word from Mr. Simonian. Direct democracy is a real particularity, but Switzerland has another one, and this here, we are not here at a political meeting, and I don't have the right to vote, but it is the Swiss Popular Party, the SVP, as the abbreviation is in German, is a real strange animal. I'm not saying that this vote was below the radar in the rest of the world. But there are all sorts of issues, the minarets and all the others, Schengen, and the posters that have been produced by this political party have played a very important part in the perception. And this political party has really turned all these debates into polemic and has polarized debate. Oh, yes, on this subject of Schengen and free movement, here the people has voted in the right way. Oh, no, but I'm thinking of the campaigns. Well, you mentioned the campaigns. I didn't. Yes, sir. Please remember, you have 1 minute only to put your question.
Can you hear me? Yes. My name is Fernando Morales de la Cruz, and it's very interesting to hear you talk, but if one looks at Switzerland from outside, one would never think that this is a small country. Even if you only have the same amount of people as Honduras, and you have been in the news a bit like Honduras in the last few months, one would have to always say that you have not only...
We didn't arrest the president, though. So.
I hope
we didn't.
No.
Missed the good.
Anyway, one would have to say that you're not only liked, admired, and respected, but you're also envied. And this is something that we have to think about, because it's a competitive world out there, and there are some people who would like to eat you, not only your chocolates and drink your milk or cheese, but you know, they would like to have your share of the pharmaceutical industry, your share of the intellectual property, your share of knowledge, and your share of patents and trademarks. And I think beyond the financial center, which is of course a global player, you're already a global country. The question is, being a global country, as IBM was global 15 years ago, are you willing to reinvent yourself as IBM forgot to? And perhaps you have to start reinventing yourself while you're still ahead, because you're definitely ahead. Your knowledge is impressive, and as Mrs. Bruderer-Wyss pointed out, your vocational schools are exceptional.
Verschiedene ausgezeichnete Punkte.
Well, a number of excellent points. Just a question of envy. Obviously, students who's top of the class is likely to be the subject of envy. Is that a historical problem? Those countries that come top of the class are not treated friendly? No, envy is not the problem. The problem is when you lose your advantages that get you there. Therein lies the question. Is Swiss still going to be in an enviable position at the end of this century? There's no sure answer to that, because obviously there's an extraordinary level of competition in the world today. After 500 years of Western dominance, suddenly we find that there is the possibility that the engine of growth in the world economy, for the first time in centuries, shift to Asia, to India, to China. The world is changing very quickly, and Switzerland cannot stand aside from all of these processes. But what can you do if the whole of the West is losing importance? Well, yes, the world is changing. Obviously, what we need to do is change as well. Reinvent ourselves. Not because we want to still be enviable. We don't want to be envied by others, but we feel that we have a role, a voice in the world for human rights, we're serving as an intermediary between countries with problems. That's in terms of our foreign relations. And at the domestic level, we want to be a country that works, which provides opportunity for its citizens with a good education and health system. That's the reason why you're absolutely right. And we cannot say that there's no need for fundamental change. I believe that there is. I would say that we need a form of government in which we can believe. That's a legitimate question. The Parliament believes that. I believe that. Our government is burdened with operative tasks. Now, obviously it needs to be, but it doesn't have the space for strategic considerations and planning, and I think it needs this space. It needs the time for that space, and that's why we need reform.
Yes, I agree that this is important to stay as innovative and competitive as possible economically, and that one has to reinvent oneself continuously. That's also true in politics. Switzerland is a country that in the past few years has increasingly given itself a global policy, a global profile. We have many assets. Mrs. Bruder has just enumerated them. But please bear in mind the difference between IBM and Switzerland, for example. The discrepancy between economic globalization and political space that we have, this is something that has to be discussed again and again afresh and reinvented. And you don't do it in the same way when you come from IBM, a company that has a board of directors and that can position itself on the world market. The political dynamics between integration and the political system, the way people think and believe, their traditions and so on, the way they experience globalization, their fears, their expectations, this is the big challenge. But I do agree with the question you put and your idea. I think it was very well put. It's exactly here that one has to reinvent oneself. Mr. Sarkozy, you saw yesterday, said that France can do it differently because it's a centralized state, but maybe there's no following at the popular level. When you say that Switzerland should reinvent itself, you, Mr. Tielemans, may say that Switzerland should do so as an ethical example. Yes, that would be great, because Switzerland does have the potential. Just to come back to direct democracy once more, one should work on this democratic cultural. I don't think that direct democracy is simply to throw into the voting box one's preferences. One also has to think about this fundamentally. I'm going to spoil the game here and question this issue of integration. Switzerland, I don't think, will be able to reinvent itself ethically if it just puts the economy at the center of interest. I think the government, the state, has to see to it that the cohabitation is free, fair and just, not only at the national level, but also at the international level, cohabitation with other countries. And not only to see it, what will it give us? What can we extract from it? What is our profit? The banking secrecy is not just Switzerland. There are other aspects as well. Then the gentleman at the back of the hall standing up, and who's now getting the microphone. I work in development cooperation in India and in Africa. When you talk about minarets and the votes, one may not forget that a large majority of the population simply said no because of the fear of a further exporting of weapons to Pakistan. And this is something that should be raised again in the discussion before the vote of the 29th of November. The University of St. Gall fortunately has this Institute of Ethics in Economics, and is a very interesting and has a leadership position in making us think about ethics in the economy. There's been some warning signals in the past. Mr. Baer, for example, said about banking secrecy and tax evasion and fraud is like making a distinction between whether one is allowed to kill one's mother or only one's mother-in-law. Now, I have a question for Mr. Maurer regarding the UN. The Millennium Goal is to halve extreme poverty by 2015. And we would like Switzerland to do something about that because it's in our constitution. So what are you doing to make sure that we reach this goal? Also to make sure that extreme wealth is also halved so that we can reach this goal. Perhaps he could give us his opinion on this. I am there to represent the political programs and policies of the Swiss government, and I do that at the UN. And you know, the UN is very committed to development cooperation, both at the practical, pragmatic, and political level. We support the UN funds and programs. We make sure that development and cooperation work is very effective. We do that at the World Bank. We always look for better solutions for and in development and cooperation work. The Millennium Development Goals are really the yardstick for Switzerland, both in bilateral and multilateral terms. Do you think that more should be done? Is the gentleman right? Yes, indeed. One should do much more towards reaching all these goals and objectives, and it is perhaps a point of dispute. Development and cooperation is not just a matter of transferring money. Obviously, it's part of the development and cooperation goals. Most of the highly industrialized countries have not succeeded in doing this since 2000, are not actually practicing what they preach, have not followed the rules or the provisions. But in the development goals, it is mentioned very clearly that the developing countries have to make an effort when it comes to good governance and human rights and democratic practices. So all those involved are certainly not on course or not in a satisfactory way, and that is why Mr. Correa has to write this book about the billions, and unfortunately we will not be reaching all the goals despite the efforts. We cannot translate what the gentleman is saying. He's speaking without a microphone, unfortunately.
Okay. Man wüsste, was man machen. Wir haben es verstanden. Man wüsste.
Yes, Yes, we got it. We got it. We know what should be done. Well, between knowing what has to be done and political consensus in the community of nations, there is a big difference. But we feel that we are one of the important countries as members of the UN who are working hard on getting this political consensus. You also put this question of the ethical side. This is a question of justice and equal chances, opportunities, and resources. This is something that will overtake us if we don't find the answer to this question. Here we are at this podium, and we might have even greater problems at that time than we do now. The Millennium Development Goals is something that we see every day. It's like a mirror we look into every day, and we cannot avoid these problems or achieving these goals. May I ask the Anglo-Saxons here whether for Switzerland this would be a USP, a unique selling position, that we are the best and the most generous state? We are precursors, we are trailblazers in these political issues. One has to be careful. It's not quite certain that development aid really helps. Mr. Moyo was here last year. No, that cuckoo clock was a bit tempestuous in its ringing. You hadn't even spoken a couple of seconds. It's not a Swiss clock. It's a clock that was made in the Black Forest. No, probably in China. The book entitled Dead Aid says that before you send more millions to Africa, read this book by Mr. Moira. Theory about development aid is changing at present. And it's an important change that is happening. More can be obtained through investment than through development aid, and that too is a challenge for Switzerland. Yes, but you are kind of sidestepping the ultimate goal. You can quibble about the method, but the investments would have to be done in a very consistent way. It's not a question of whether Switzerland should be best or first, but Switzerland should be able to mobilize and motivate others. Only something will happen if everyone pulls on the same oar. So Switzerland should be a role model. I don't think that quantity is the yardstick or the volume. It may be positive, but it shouldn't come first. If I may just respond to the gentleman who put the first question, envy. I'm not a historian. My colleague has the long-term perspective. I'm just the short-term journalist who writes from today to tomorrow. I've had contacts with those who are involved in promotional work in the 26 cantons, and they try and get companies from abroad to come and set up in Switzerland. A big multinational decided to move its headquarters to Geneva or to Zurich. And Ireland, which just one of the examples that used to be the host of this multinational, of course, wasn't very happy about that. So you shouldn't be too successful either. There are many inequalities. There are regions that are at a disadvantage and others that are at an advantage. So is fiscal competition a good thing, locally, internationally? Is it amoral? Let's ask the ethicist. I wouldn't say that it's immoral. What we're talking about here is not a kind of competition that deserves the name competition. People need to emigrate or move from their country to another country, and therefore it isn't legitimate. It's a competition of services or performance. Migration of capital is another thing. But as to this fiscal competition or competition of fiscal services, one has to be aware. You know, there's a cantonal competition, but this is within a framework, and it is a competition between services, and it attracts people from one canton to another. But I would agree, even such a competition, a fiscal competition or competition in fiscal services, is always in the interest of higher income groups. And cantonal repayments would not change this. But one should put this question to politicians. Why is it such a good thing, this competition between fiscal services? Maybe it's simply because one doesn't trust cantonal governments to take the right decisions. Mr. Maurer? I was also going to say the following. I wouldn't give an ethical response, but for as long as it is seen in such political terms, it's legitimate and it'll simply happen, it'll exist. You mentioned the word rules or laws, and I think that is exactly the point. One has to find international rules and legislation regarding taxation and fiscal conditions. Even in Switzerland, there's no harmonization, so internally there's already a lot of competition between the cantons. I think that is the main challenge, as I mentioned earlier on. I don't want to give the impression that the Swiss government or administration lives in an ivory tower and has illusions about the banking secrecy continuing to exist in the same way for another 15 years. I think everyone has recognized that if Switzerland wants to remain innovative and reinvent itself and remain a financial center with a good reputation, changes have to be made. Now, the Cuckoo Clock is telling me that we have to make very short statements by way of conclusion. Exchange of information is not fiscal harmonization. It's a question of fiscal autonomy of states that has to be preserved. One should have different fiscal systems, but one doesn't have to push fiscal harmonization to such an extent. I like my function as a president of the National Council, but it also keeps me a bit captive. The Parliament feels that it's a good thing, but my personal opinion may be a bit different. I'm going to express it here. I think it can only be healthy within a certain range. And this spiral, which turns the screw again and again, which is something we feel in Switzerland, we know is leading to tension and inequalities, which is not in the interest of a healthy country. So this is my personal opinion, but officially, the Parliament is backing this fiscal competition, but of course the people will decide itself what it feels about this.
Well, tax competition doesn't create inequality. That's wrong. It's the free market economy which creates inequality. That's how the world works. The question is, if taxes are so high, whether or not in the name of social justice, does growth suffer? That's the problem for all developed countries. Order, please. This is a difficult balance to strike, but tax competition does help. And it protects us in England, in particular, from this danger. The English Parliament always has heckles as well, so please let him finish. That's all I have to say. Well, when I was here 6 years ago, I had no idea that there were 26 cantons, or indeed that there were different taxes between cantons and communities. I live in a relatively low tax community on the right bank of the Lake of Zurich, but I live there for a reason. people said that Zurich is a tenth the size of Berlin, and you had to be careful about not having a school on one side of the lake and your house on the other. So that's why we chose where to live. But later, a very well-known Swiss banker who has been in charge of a well-known German bank for the last couple of years said, we live in Küsnacht and my office is in Seefeld and the school's around the corner. And he said, yes, that's a very good idea, low taxes. And then one question from the person in the light blue shirt.
Good.
Ich bedauere es.
Well, my name is Martin Kaufer. I regret that the discussion has avoided certain questions from the representatives of the Federation and a Swiss university. The word banking secrecy was used. There is no banking secrecy. You can go out and walk into any bank where you will be well received. What the secrecy is about is banking customer. What's being protected is the private sphere of the customer. And if I were asked, I think for a long time the Swiss will not want to do away with it because if it's a question of what shares I've traded this morning, it has nothing to do with the tax office. There's no tax on share price rises, no capital gains tax. And there are many reasons for people to come to Switzerland, not just capital flight, but also people who have not found themselves protected by the tax authorities. They come to Switzerland for this kind of protection of their private sphere. I think there are many young people here today, and I think it's wrong to address these issues of banking customer secrecy in this negative tone. I understand what you're saying. It's a semantic question. It's just an abbreviation, but you're saying that there are good reasons for the citizens to remember the purpose. Well, yes, no, it is a question of the wrong words being used. Banking secrecy is not actually the secrecy of banking. It's banking customer secrecy, which was introduced for very good reasons, and it's your home country that wanted to do that. I didn't say banking customer secrecy, but what I did try and do was to outline the various elements of banking secrecy or bank customer secrecy to show that there are certain distinctions that need to be made in the various functions of it. And I believe that for the population of Switzerland, it's very important to clearly distinguish which areas of banking customer secrecy are under pressure and what changes might be made in the future, what the protection of private sphere is. We cannot spend much more time discussing this, but very briefly. You talked about the private sphere. I don't know why capital income is not discriminated, and revenue income, salary income is, because this is completely transparent for taxes. Now, what cannot be done is to use these benefits to escape the measures in other countries. Yes, that was my point, indeed. And it's something that we need to reflect upon. It brings 20 billion in state revenues. Well, we see that there is a broad range of views, and it goes from right to left, or perhaps the other way around. So, final question. Do we need to act quickly? Is there a fire in the Swiss house? Well, I can't answer. I'm not a diplomat. I'm just talking about the ethical aspect. And the ethical aspect is that refusing to exchange information under any circumstances is not justifiable. I think that Switzerland should stand up and say that it is willing to do so. We have the same problem as we did in the 70s, where the Federal Council said it's not something that can be justified. But parts of the Swiss population do believe that it is possible. We need to work towards the recognition of the fact that it's illegitimate to not exchange information. Mr. Maurer. I think I've clearly stated what I wanted to say on this subject. I think that bank customer secrecy, I agree absolutely with what you said. It was purely a convenient abbreviation that I was using. I think it's coming under international pressure. We have a problem of perception, and I think it's good to address the issues which are being put under pressure and look towards the future, and I've hinted at what direction that could take. Well, with regard to this discussion, as Ambassador Maurer has said, we need to take an active role. We can construct the way ahead. And I think that we have an important financial centre and we can participate. We can take an offensive position in the discussions ahead. And it is better to be proactive than reactive. Apart from the points that have just been mentioned, we also need to recognise the full width of our foreign relations. It's not just taxes and finance. We have a very broad range of activities. We do very good work, and we do that both externally and internally. I think internally as well, at domestic level, there are other areas. We're facing increasing unemployment. We need to take that seriously. We need to take the people seriously. And now that we've dealt perhaps with the urgent situation of the economy, we need to deal with the urgent situation of people facing unemployment. And that's the direction for our country. A very provocative historian that we have with us today. Perhaps you could give us a provocative tip. Well, first of all, apologies for my German. At least I tried it. It was very difficult. What the main question for me is, for the future of this country, is does Switzerland belong to Europe? We've not said anything about the European Union. I find that very surprising. Does this country belong to Europe, or does it belong amongst the Caribbean islands, or should it go into partnership with Iceland outside Europe? Are you talking about the membership of the EU, or not from an institutional perspective? I just find it very surprising that we haven't mentioned it at all. That's the main question for me. That's something we have to think about, says the moderator. Well, as the final speaker, I won't be very original, but I'll try to summarize. What makes up a country's image is very complicated. Obviously, it's made up of multiple factors, not just humanitarian aid or banking secrecy. Switzerland is facing huge challenges, and whether they are greater today than they were in the past, I'm not sure, because I'm not a historian, but I do know that the challenges are major challenges. Once I said that the words imagination and Swiss government are not words that are seen together in the same sentence. I can only support Ms. Bruderer and say that Switzerland needs to use its imagination. It needs to work proactively in order to take up its place in the world. Thank you very much. Thank you to the excellent panelists. Well, we need to move on. The Cuckoo Clock sellers showed imagination. We can. I see that there's a question to adjust here. Maybe we can adjust our democracy, and you can adjust from a cuckoo to Big Ben, but it's not working. So we have problems in Switzerland. It's been very exciting to talk about them all. Thank you very much.
Danke vielmals.